This is Rob Neyer, and you are watching the Break It Down show.
Yeah, this is fun. We get to do this again. We did it last year. Dan McLaughlin's joining me. He's obviously been writing about baseball for years as well. And Rob, it's always a pleasure to have you on, the commissioner. Are you still the commissioner, or have you given that title up?
I'll give it up when they rip it out of my dead cold hands.
Love it, love it. I am excited to hear that. Actually, I'm hoping to get up and see a game up in your guys' league this year, if the COVID virus allows it.
Well, we are planning to play, that's for sure, and with our Canadian teams this year too, which we weren't able to do last year.
Yeah. That's right. You don't even think about that, the international travel thing. We're here to talk about the Hall of Fame, and it's the season for it. I guess we should start with the golden era folks, the people from the that have already been selected for induction this year. Any thoughts, Rob, on Minnie, Miñoso, Jim Kaat, that kind of thing?
Well, I guess what I would say is that I have a lot of thoughts. I try not to obsess over the Hall of Fame the way that I once did and had to for professional reasons, but they basically just threw in everybody who had a really great case, or a really good case, I should say, of one sort or another. There are legitimate reasons why none of those guys had been elected. I personally think that some of them deserved election and some of them didn't deserve election. But you can make a good case for all of them and more. Basically, everyone on the ballot. And frankly, I think everyone on the ballot is going to wind up being elected. Maybe not everyone, but certainly Dick Allen. I mean, he seems to be next in line. The message, the overall message seems to be that if someone is beloved enough, they will be elected. And it's the statistics are almost irrelevant. Does that mean Roger Maris gets in someday? I don't know. Maybe. So but there is a limit. I don't think we're going to see who's someone else who had a very short career who was beloved.
On Mattingly.
Well, his career wasn't that short.
Okay.
I think he's going to make it eventually. Yeah, in part because he was beloved. No, I think he's probably a good example. Come to think of it, was he better than Bobby Grich? No, but is he more beloved? Yes. So he's going to wind up in. Steve Garvey is another example of a
Dale
guy
Murphy.
who was truly Dale Murphy absolutely is a great example. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, Dale Murphy. There's others, and then also we have this thing with the Harold Baines induction. And I'm a Harold Baines fan. I mean, I like Harold, and I think that there's at least a reasonable part of the discussion that he gets there. And if you count the time that he lost due to strikes, he's even better of a candidate. But he changes the thing, and that makes like Steve Garvey and Oliver and all these other characters that are, Johnny Damon would fall into that category where you're like, well, Harold Baines is in. All of a sudden, you have to start to look at other players. And maybe that is the right answer. I mean, I don't know what the percentage of players who have ever played who end up in the Hall of Fame, but it's got to be a tiny percentage. And then I want to also add in a guy like Jim Kaat. If Jim Kaat is in, then we have to have Tommy John at some point, if not partly because his surgery and his recovery, I mean, that changed an entire era. You could call that the post-Tommy John era of baseball. And the guy also won, I think, 283 games going off of memory. That's pretty good. And Burt Blyleven's in. Those guys were all in the same little 270 to 280 win cohort. Has Harold Baines changed what is acceptable, you think, because of his being clearly below that line of borderline?
Well, I think Harold Baines utterly changed the conversation because the election of Harold Baines made it clear that if a group of people were put into a room and allowed to elect, given the chance to elect someone who had a good story but was not a great player, did not raise the existing standards of the Hall of Fame, nobody would complain. And that player would be celebrated just as if he were any other Hall of Famer. And now, again, it's worth noting that had happened many times in the past, especially in the late 60s and early 70s. As you guys are both well aware, the Veterans Committee was profligate in the late 60s and early 70s, electing a dozen or dozens of players who lowered the standards. George Kelly comes to mind immediately, Dave Bancroft, the list goes on and on. And then the Hall of Fame recognized that it happened and took a lot of heat for it and went away from that and didn't really allow that to happen much at all in the 80s and the 90s. And you saw things like, Ron Santo failing to be elected time after time by the Veterans Committee. And then the Hall of Fame took a lot of criticism for that and went back in the other direction, went back to putting 12 people in a room and having them talk it out. And that's where we are now. And there's no criticism whatsoever. It's just celebration. And maybe that's okay. It's not how I would do it, but it seems to be where the institution is right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think we really have reached. I mean, when you look at this year's ballot, both the folks that went in through the various committees, which to me, I still call them the Veterans Committee, but I know it's sort of I guess these are subcommittees of the Veterans Committee or something like that. But and then you look at the guys who are still on the writers' ballot. It seems to be that an enormous amount of what we're talking about at this point is definitional. We're not, instead of having a standard and trying to measure guys against the standard, and there are a few guys where that's the argument, but so many of these guys, it's a question of what should the standard be? Should we be mixing and matching guys who played part of their career in the integrated leagues and part in the Negro leagues, mixing and matching guys who were ball players and managers, maybe ball players and broadcasters? Should we be considering, steroids? Should we be considering sort of people's off the field, issues with women or their politics or their good character? And there's so many of these. And I mean, you referenced Tommy John. My brothers and I, when we had these Hall of Fame arguments, we used to sometimes get to the point where we're going like this, and that was to reference the idea that, well, maybe if your standard is innovations in the game, you should put in Steve Yeager because he invented the little thing that hangs down from the catcher's mask. I mean, I really do think we're getting into so much of these definitional arguments, and I think that those of us who are, I think this is almost sort of, it bleeds a little bit into kind of the stat heads versus traditionalists stuff that was all the rage 20 years ago, and I feel like there's a certain amount of exhaustion in the sports writing world for all of that. Like those battles have been won to a certain extent, but also people are just kind of, I don't know. I feel like there's a whole couple generations of writers and commentators who are just sort of exhausted beating their heads against the wall, making the same arguments every year.
Yeah, I want to ask Rob about some of these numbers because we've I'll say we've beatified war, even though there's a schism, right? We're getting religious with our references, but there's a schism between them. But Bill James would say war is incomplete; it stops before it gets to the final answer, and it leaves things out. So we know there will be a stat after war, and will that completely change things? And then the other thing is we've tremendously devalued wins. And I'm in the camp where wins were overvalued, but they don't have no value. Like saying, I'm going to stay in, I'm going to get this win, I'm with this team, has value in that pitcher stays in and they find a way and they have grit. There is value in that. So how do these arguments move around, do you think, Rob, when we look at the value of numbers and how we evaluate things? And, David Ortiz is a great, I think, example here where we have this steroid problem. And, David Ortiz has the taint of steroids on him, and it appears that he likely will get into the Hall of Fame in spite of that. And then Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens and these other guys won't, and it's their last year in the ballot.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, Pete.
Yes,
I'll try to just touch on one thing, and maybe Dan I can pass the baton to Dan. Dan makes a good point about the reactionary nature of, I think, of some of what is happening now with the stats versus sabermetrics stuff. There's certainly I think you certainly heard some echoes of that when Baines was elected from the committee, no question. Now, you mentioned wins, though. Yes, I don't disagree with you that wins have value and durability has value, but I think it's worth pointing out that when Tommy John and Jim Kaat were not elected by the writers, wins were still supreme in the minds of most writers. They just didn't think that Kaat and John had enough, right or wrong. The problem for Kaat and John was they didn't get to 300, which was the magic number. I think still probably would be or is. And the truth is that Kaat and John were not particularly dominant as, say, Tom Seaver was or Jim Palmer. Are those high standards? Absolutely. But generally speaking, the writers, and this has been true since day one, 70 whatever years ago, the writers have almost always held players to a much higher standard than the various other committees that were given the chance to vote after the writers got through with a player. But it wasn't a disregard for wins that kept Kaat and John and others out. It was an insistence by the writers that the standards be kept at a very high level, and many people would probably think too high a level. I happen to think that, sure, 280 wins, you get it, bonus points for durability, you belong in the Hall of Fame, but that's a very subjective judgment.
Yeah, I mean, what's the difference between Milt Pappas, Drysdale, and Jim Kaat? That's one of those guys. Well, two of those guys are in now, but for a long time, only one of those guys was in. Brilliance for sure, but durability, that matters.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to pitcher wins, I mean, I think it is important to have the context of time, too. I mean, I think that, first of all, pitcher wins absolutely do matter over a career, but I think they matter less and less with each passing year, in the sense that just, in the modern game, the connection is much more attenuated between the quality of the pitcher and the number of wins he racks up. It just, the more the game goes to the relief pitchers, the less you can draw a line between what a pitcher accomplishes and the W's. But I think also, I mean, I think Kaat and John, I mean, like Rob said, I think they very fairly, in my view, were knocked by the writers because the writers looked at them and said, hey, there's all these other guys who pitched against them who were better and who won more games. And so those big numbers in the 280s are impressive, but they're not impressive enough to get you in just on your career number. And I mean, yeah, they won more games than Jim Palmer, for example, but Palmer was unquestionably better at his peak. And in particular in his prime. I tend to think, we had this long argument about peak value and career value. I tend to think in terms of prime value. Like, you take, what are the guy's years that he was a top level player, stretch that out, his 10-year prime or whatever, and what is he doing there? But I think the writers put those guys in the context of their day and found them wanting. And I think that what you have now, in part, is people's memories are changing, because now they're looking at saying, hey, wait a minute, Andy Pettit won, 256 games, and that seems like a huge number now. And then you've got these guys hanging out in the 280s. How can we keep them out, without really understanding how much the game has changed? And that's sort of, that's sort of the same process by which people in the 1970s decided that, or in like 1969 decided that Pie Traynor was the greatest third baseman ever because he was a 320 hitter, right? Being a 320 hitter didn't pop people's eyes out when Traynor was playing. When it's 4 decades later and guys are winning the batting title hitting 301, all of a sudden those numbers look bigger.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, the context. When we do our analysis, we tend to contextualize players within their time and their conditions. But absolutely, Dan's right. People are not contextualizing them throughout many decades of baseball history, and that changes things quite a bit.
One of the interesting things is we continue to try to struggle with the Negro leagues and what we're going to do with them. Buck O'Neill finally gets in. I would love to just have the default of, hey, this guy's old, let him enjoy it for a couple of years and let him in. I'm a bigger than big hall guy, like I'll vote for 15 people here. I don't mind. It doesn't hurt my feelings to have a museum full of wonderful people who are enshrined. But at some point, we are going to run out of folks who were in the Negro leagues and had enough of an impact. Bud Fowler, of course, I think deserving, but we're going to run out of founders. We're going to run out of players. I mean, Bob Kendrick, I think, should go in for his work if we're going to do all these, kind of things. But at some point, we have to close the door on that. Or are we able to? Or is there enough guilt and payback due that we have to continue to bring in players? And I don't want to say lower the bar, but make the club bigger.
Well, Pete, I would say that there have been multiple times, twice, maybe 3 times, where the Hall of Fame created a process to elect Negro Leaguers and said afterward, that was it.
Yeah.
We've done all we can do. We don't know enough. Or we have, whether they said this explicitly or not, we have done what was appropriate. Now we're going to let this go. Right. And every time they've gone back some years later and said, you know what, we need to revisit this. And I absolutely guarantee you that as long as we are alive, their Negro Leaguers will be elected to the Hall of Fame. New Negro Leaguers will be elected. I don't think the process will ever end. Is that appropriate? Well, I think it I love the idea of electing Negro League players who raise the standards of the institution or maintain the standards. But we seem to have now basically decided that there aren't really any standards per se. And we're all okay with that. So I think that electing players as essentially as symbols of various things, white, black, 1920, 1980, that's just where the institution has gone and is probably going to continue going. So I don't see why they would stop electing Negro Leaguers anytime ever.
Yeah. I'm curious what you guys' thoughts are. We go to this I love the Baseball Hall of Fame tracker, and it's just such a great resource. So everybody should check that out. I think the link, I'll put the link up here in a second. This tracker kind of gives you an idea of the public ballots and where they're at. And one of the interesting things with the public ballots is one of the writers, and I guess we won't say his name just to not create any extra kind of fire for him. Not that it's not public, but he elected nobody. He picked nobody on his ballot. Is there a responsibility as a writer to do something better than send in a blank ballot, or is that legitimate?
Dan, what do you think?
I mean, I think if there's nobody who deserves it, that's perfectly fine. But I have a hard time seeing how you can look at this ballot and say there's nobody on it who deserves it, unless you're just, sort of the grumpy old man sports writer who says, the whole steroid era is tainted. And I mean, look down this list, pretty much everybody played through it, right? So a pox on all their, but I just don't think that's right. I mean, look, I'm very much, I'm not a character clause guy. I think Shoeless Joe doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame because he broke the one absolutely unbreakable baseball rule, which is you play the games to win the games. But I'd be inclined to put in basically everybody else if they're good enough as a player without getting into, the steroid stuff. Because, I mean, it is such a minefield for the writers, because then you've got to judge. I mean, on the steroids in particular, you've got to judge, who got caught, who maybe didn't get caught, but we'll find out later on after we put them in that they did it. And then there's these other guys who have a cloud of suspicion over them who probably shouldn't. And we've seen a number of those, like Piazza and Bagwell and such, who had to deal with this stuff. And so far as we know, they never did anything really wrong. But, there was sort of an odor hanging over guys like them, and people do the kind of tea leaf reading of, this guy bulked up a lot when he got to a certain age. And, maybe that seems suspicious. Is it more or less suspicious if you're dealing with, say, a Dominican ball player, because those guys are more likely to have grown up without the world's best nutrition and whatnot. And so they're more likely maybe to sort of blossom physically when they get to the States. On the other hand, quite a number of the guys that we're looking at on the ballot who were Dominican ball players actually got caught. So we're not, at that point, we're not speculating about them. But there's just so many imponderables. And I just think we should vote in the guys who were the best ball players.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I have absolutely zero doubt that multiple players have been elected who used a lot of steroids. I mean, it just seems like to suggest otherwise would just seem to fly in the face of everything we know about baseball in that era and professional athletes in general. Not leaving aside the fact that we watched players' bodies transform, like, from 180 to 225 or 230. That happened with many players who've been elected to the Hall of Fame. You look at them now. Granted, players get bigger, but I would challenge people to go find players for me in the 1950s or 60s whose bodies changed the way that so many players did in the 1980s and 90s. Yes, and there's weight training. I get it, but it's just silly to suggest that there aren't many guys in the Hall of Fame who use steroids. Not to mention amphetamines. That's a whole other issue, which yeah. we've all gone down that path many times. Not of using amphetamines, but of talking about players using amphetamines. So I would agree with Dan. I think for the most part, we should just put the guys in who were the best players. Now, you do wind up with a lot of players who we have suspicions about piled up big numbers while lots of other guys were piling up big numbers, right? I mean, I get that Gary Sheffield was a great hitter, and his numbers are comparable to lots of other guys who have been elected or will be elected. I also know that there's a lot of competition there, and I guess the answer is, this gets to something that a lot of writers complain about, which is that they can vote for only 10 guys per ballot. And a lot of the writers think it should be unlimited. And I'm not wild about that. I actually like the idea of having to sort of think about it and make distinctions. To me, opening the ballot up and saying you can vote for as many guys as you want, I just think it makes it almost too easy, that process. It should be hard, right? I think.
Yeah. First of all, it's partly the writer's own fault that there's too many guys, because you look at the guys who ought to be in there, and there's a bunch of these guys on their 8th and 10th year. And look, I mean, it's not just the Hall isn't just for the ball players, right? And I think it just makes a mockery of the Hall of Fame to walk in there and Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens and Pete Rose aren't there. It just does. But I do think there ought to be maybe a little more option since you're already in this situation, for the writers to be able to check a box and say, you know what, I'd like to see this guy stay on the ballot next year. Mm-hmm. And if there's enough of those, then maybe somebody who's in danger of falling off, the writers get to decide. And maybe you raise that threshold. Maybe you have guys who've been on the ballot 15 years, and if you have enough votes to keep them on the ballot, you keep them on the ballot another year. I think something like that would be a much more reasonable way of addressing the problem, rather than just letting people willy-nilly decide to, that they want 20 Hall of Famers this year.
The thing with steroids that kind of bothers me is we just kind of put it into a dumb bag and say that's steroids and I don't like it. We just recently saw the Zips projections used on the careers of Clemens and Bonds and what they might have could have done. But we also see Tom Brady performing at an MVP level because he's cared about the intake in his body and approached this thing at a level that someone like Bonds was doing already. So I'm not saying that Barry Bonds didn't do steroids, but we don't know what the impact is. We just don't know what the difference between. I mean, look, Greg Vaughn did steroids. He didn't have a long career. He didn't sustain it. Brady Anderson possibly did steroids and had this one brilliant year. There is a grade to how much it impacts their ability to play and also perform. We don't have a good handle on it. And it seems like that we've gotten to the point where we probably could kind of suss out, is it a 10% boost? Okay, well then Barry Bonds hits just short of 700 home runs, but it's still 690 some odd home runs. is pretty damn good. What are your guys' thoughts on the impact of steroids and our inability to test, what it meant? Todd Stottlemyre came back. He said 1 year, I blew up my rotator cuff, but I worked out the rest of my body. And I mean, it was preposterous on the face, but he didn't have a long career. He didn't stay around long enough to accumulate a Hall of Fame career. So what is the impact of steroids on, when the pitchers are throwing harder and throwing longer and everything else? What is that? How do we even play with that?
Well, I'll just briefly say that that's a question that whole books have been written about, and I'm not an expert at all.
Right.
I will say that yes, you're absolutely right. Projecting performance for those guys absent drugs, sports drugs, is incredibly difficult. Although I'm sure that somebody has tried, and probably somebody else has done a really good job. When I was thinking about this and writing a lot about it, what I would say, and I'm not sure if I would still come to the same conclusion, but if I have to make some sort of distinction, I would look at a player like Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens and say, look, before it seems like he was really into drugs, was he a Hall of Famer? Right? Did he already have a Hall of Fame career, or was he clearly heading toward a Hall of Fame career? In the case of those two guys, the answer is obviously yes, right? If we buy the reports, and with guys like Clemens and Bonds, you have a little more certainty because so much has been written about them that you can get a sense for when they probably did start using drugs. It's like looking at somebody's body or their hat size can get you only so far, but when there's been all these deep dives into how they were living their lives and who they were hanging out with, you could get a better feel for it. But there are a lot of players you don't really have that. So it is tricky, which is why it's so difficult to make those distinctions. But I think in the case of Bonds and McGwire's a really tough one. For example, it's not clear. He set a rookie home run record, right? Amazingly talented guy whose body became completely different. Whatever, a few years into his career, we all remember those rookie images of him when he was sort of doughy, right? Clearly a world-class athlete, but not what he would become. Bonds and Clemens both transformed their bodies, but they were amazing players for many years before they did those things. If I have to make a distinction, I might make it there, but it's a lot easier just not to worry about all that stuff in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think, I think it definitely, how much it helps is going to depend on the player and the skill set and their dedication to lifting and all. And, I always remember Bill James's line about how giving Fenway Park to Jim Rice was like giving Superman brass knuckles, right? And that's sort of what, I think there's no question that we have some idea when Bonds and Clemens started using. If those guys had retired at the point they started using, they would have been Hall of Famers, right? They were already the best guys, in the business at that point. Which I get why that grinds the gears of some of the writers, because there's more of a sense that these weren't like, some guy who was worried about getting sent back to the sugarcane fields in the Dominican and wanted to make sure that he could provide for his family. These were guys who were already superstars with multi-million-dollar contracts and a plaque being readied for them. McGwire really is a strange case, because I feel like McGwire, if you looked at him, first of all, as a rookie, you could see that this guy was somebody who, if he lifted and worked out and just naturally grew, that he had a big frame to grow into. But I feel like with McGwire in particular, it made a much bigger difference in terms of keeping him healthy for a brief period. I mean, he broke down after that. But his biggest issue was getting in the lineup. And again, maybe that's more sympathetic, but I don't know that we want to get that far into who is and isn't sympathetic. And then, you have somebody like A-Rod. I mean, I don't know what exactly A-Rod may have done or when, but I mean, people were looking at A-Rod as a potential Hall of Famer when he was in high school. And so, A-Rod didn't really have a big physical transformation. I mean, from the day he was drafted, he looked like he was pretty much what he was for his whole career.
Yep.
But I do think we can't know exactly how much it matters, and particularly with pitchers where the steroids may have had much more to do with their ability to bounce back and stay healthy than necessarily their velocity, particularly the relievers. But I what I reject though is this sort of there are some of these kind of denialists who just say, oh it doesn't do anything, it doesn't matter, and I'm just like, look at any list of the all-time home run hitters, and you might notice that they tend to be bigger, stronger guys than it's not just that. There are big, strong guys who don't have an uppercut, okay? But and there are guys like, Ricky Henderson who had, enough of an uppercut to be able to hit a fair number of home runs from being not a very big guy. But or Joe Morgan. But at the end of the day, of course, physical strength matters. Of course it does. So that I don't buy.
The other thing that seems to matter is the defensive capability. That's probably the strongest part of Andrew Jones's case, is he was such a fantastic center fielder. And Rob, we've discussed him in the past. One of the things that always struck me about Andrew Jones is he was just always under the ball, like he expected it to be there. But he also had, half of a Hall of Fame career in terms of offensive capability and at some point defensive capability. If we're going to have guys like Harmon Killebrew and Mark McGwire be in the Hall of Fame because they could touch a baseball and it would go 500 feet more than anybody else, what about someone like Andrew Jones? And what about someone like Adam Dunn, who also could hit the ball a long way, but just didn't quite do it as long as someone like McGwire and Killebrew?
Well, I think Dunn falls off because of career length. But Jones is a fascinating case. The distinction I would make between Jones and Killebrew, and look, Killebrew, I'm not wild about him as a Hall of Famer. He had little defensive value, and he played in a relatively weak league his entire career, the American League in the 1960s and early 70s. But the one thing we do know about Harmon Killebrew, we know almost exactly how good he was, right? Because we're really good at measuring home runs and walks and stadium effects. I could be wrong about this. I don't think we know as much about Andrew Jones's defensive value as we know about Harmon Killebrew's hitting value. I think that if you buy into the fielding numbers that we've seen for Jones, you can make he has a Hall of Fame resume. I'm just not comfortable yet enough with those numbers to believe that we do know enough. We didn't have StatCast when Jones was playing, right? We have all these numbers. We have some really smart people parsing them, but was he really a better defensive player than? I think he grades out better than Willie Mays, essentially. I could be wrong about that. Do we really believe that? Maybe we do. Maybe we should. I'm just not. I haven't seen that case yet, but maybe I haven't looked hard enough.
There's also
I mean, I think it's sort of a. The extreme obvious example of that is the Negro League players. But I think even when you're dealing with defensive stats, boy, does it make me feel old though to talk about like tools we didn't have when Andrew Jones was playing, right? But Jones. I mean, Jones to me was certainly more so than, and partly this is a difference, of course, between infielders and outfielders. The ball moves so fast in the infield, but more so than any other player I've ever seen. Jones was the guy where you just saw balls come off the bat, and every instinct you had based on watching a lot of baseball was that's a hit, and then it wasn't. And just absolutely, you would never watch a Braves game with Andrew Jones in center field without that happening at least once a game.
Right.
And that seems like it adds up, and every other, the great center fielders would all have some of those, and even the bad center fielders every now and then would surprise you. But I mean, that guy, and look, obviously he didn't have, he was a significant offensive contributor, for his prime years. Again, Jones is kind of he's one of those guys our memory of him degrades a little bit because he just fell off offensively and defensively. I don't think at exactly the same time, but almost the same time, and then lingered around for a bunch of years, making good money and not contributing much. But he was such a wizard. I mean, I'm comfortable. I'd be comfortable voting him in and living with the uncertainty. I think I've got maybe 9 guys on my ballot. I think I could easily fill in a 10th, although there's like a couple of guys fighting for that 10th spot, and I'm not sure who I would give it to. But
I want to talk about ballots, but first I want to bring up another example, and this was the antithesis of that Don Mattingly example. Is Albert Bell, who was taken out by injury. That sort of benefited Kirby Puckett. We know now that maybe like some of the injuries he had might be even more dealable. We could deal with them more. I mean, Alex Rodriguez had microfracture surgery on his hip, which, by the way, is performance at least enabling, if not enhancing. We have all these things. And also, I'm curious about the case of Julio Franco. If we've recognized the Negro Leagues as a viable major league, I think it's also reasonable to say, as the Korean and the Japanese leagues, does Sadahara O get more impact? If you look at Franco's international career, it puts his hit total up to above 3,200. And if you add in any kind of benefit of the doubt for the time he served in terms of strikes and lockouts, he's well into the 3,000s. Is he a viable Hall of Famer because of his compiling and ability just to hit forever? What are you guys' thoughts on that?
I mean, I think, well, I mean, obviously, yeah, there's all sorts of things that are performance enhancing that we wouldn't consider performance enhancing. Like, I mean, George Sisler probably would have hit 400 a couple more times with, antibiotics.
Yeah.
Because he had his career derailed by a sinus infection.
Right.
Right. And there are guys in the Hall of Fame who like died when they were 28 or something,
Ted Williams had a hurt elbow his entire career. Basically, they could have just popped a new whatever in that he needed, Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you want to go down that road, like, the lack of a world war is performance enhancing for guys who played after Williams's time.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I don't buy Albert Bell as a Hall of Famer. I mean, Puckett is a weird case because so much of what happened with Puckett was sort of feel good stuff about his great character on the field and in the clubhouse, and sort of then people found out things that they didn't feel so good about his off the field life. Yeah, no, I mean, I don't buy the guys like Bell who had really short prime years.
Franco brings up an interesting. I hadn't thought about Franco, but I do think that one of the things that the Hall of Fame maybe should do, and people have been suggesting this for a long time, is finding more people like Buck O'Neil, who did a lot of things, who made contributions to the game. And I believe there's something in the voting rules about considering a contribution, but it's never really happened much. The voters have always been, at least until maybe this year, have always been instructed, I believe, to focus on a single thing that someone did. So, Joe Torrey had to wait forever because even though he had a semi-Hall of Fame career as a player, it really wasn't quite good enough. And he ultimately got elected not as a player with contributions elsewhere, but as a manager with basically no reference to his playing career. That's the reason I think, and I spoke to someone about this a long time ago, but as I recall, the reason Buck O'Neil wasn't elected to the Hall of Fame 15 years ago or 10 years ago when there was all the controversy, is that ultimately that group, which was essentially created to elect Buck O'Neil, at least to some degree, that committee of mostly historians, people who really cared about the process, and probably almost all of them or all of them loved Buck O'Neil, they couldn't figure out which box he went in. Is he a coach? Well, not really. Is he a manager? Well, for a while, yeah, but not a major league manager, at least not as we thought about the major leagues at that time. Was he a great player? No, he wasn't. So what do we do with him? Yeah. We don't know. So we can't build a consensus to elect him. Of course, we know what the reaction was to that, but they were working within the tradition of the Hall, which was you got to have a box for this person. You got to be a coach, or they got to be a manager, or an executive, whatever. And then, of course, way back when there were pioneers, but they gave up electing pioneers a long time ago. I think that now it looks like with the election of O'Neill, we are going to see some room for, I don't know if Franco qualifies, although you could certainly make a case for him for his sort of international flavor and experience, and the fact that he played into his mid to late 40s and was still effective. But I think you can make a better case for people like Lefty O'Doul, who was such an important figure in the Pacific Coast League, in Japan prior to World War II, or was it after World War II? I guess it was after. And then a great player for 3 or 4 years, right? You can make a case for someone like, Frank Jobe as a pioneer. I just think that while I'm not wild about where the process is right now, I'm hoping that it's sort of heading toward a more inclusive institution that has room for different sorts of contributions, and not just those 2 or 3 buckets that were relied on for so long.
Yeah, I think granted, you could make the case for Buck simply as a raconteur, if you will, but they didn't really have a category for that. I mean, I do think that this is, and even more so than him in a lot of ways, I feel like the election of Gil Hodges was a real breaking of silos.
Yes.
Because he's unquestionably there as a and look, there are guys who were elected in the past implicitly for that, right? I mean, why did Phil Rizzuto get in? It was supposedly for his work as a ball player, but clearly his long career as an announcer influenced that.
That's right.
I think that helped Ralph Kiner too.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have guys who have. Yeah, I'm not convinced on Franco necessarily, but I think there are guys who, when you start breaking down those silos, have a better case as a great baseball life. I don't know how Rob feels about this, but I certainly would rattle the cage for Bill James as one of those.
Oh, of course, I've made that case myself. Yeah. As a pioneer, I've always said they should revive the pioneer category, because that allows you to talk about Frank Jobe and Bill James and maybe Lefty O'Doul because of the work he did in Japan. It opens up the conversation, and they've done that now. They've opened up the conversation, but they haven't done it in an explicit sort of way. Like, exactly how did they elect Buck O'Neill again? I'm not exactly sure where he fits, except that he's he's Buck O'Neill, and there's only one Buck O'Neill, so he doesn't set a precedent maybe. But I would actually like for them to set an explicit precedent. We're going to think about these guys, and the word silo is apt. Let's forget about the silos and look at the whole picture of what these people meant to the game.
I want to get back to the Japan League thing too, but also the guys like Felipe Alou, Dusty Baker. I mean, Dusty Baker is not really a borderline Hall of Famer, but he's a damn fine player, and now he's won 2,000 games as a manager. At some point, there has to be a conversation about those guys. And again, back to the Japanese leagues, I didn't see a whole lot of Japanese players. There was not like a big integration moment like there was with Jackie Robinson. But at some point, it seems like we're going to have to consider the Japan leagues and maybe the Korean leagues as well, but as a viable major league, because there wasn't really a path. I mean, how many Japanese players played before 1980? And they were in baseball well before then. Yeah, exactly. So it wasn't like a real path there. So, I mean, and I think Sadahara O is recognized, but I don't think he's an actual Hall of Famer, right?
No. I mean, I would have no problem saying, look, this is still the American Baseball Hall of Fame. It's not there to honor guys who had great careers somewhere else. But if you have guys who are on the bubble, on their major league career, and they played significantly elsewhere, that's another story. Because that's a way of saying this guy. I mean, certainly look, if I was writing Ichiro's plaque, I would mention how many hits he got in Japan too, because it's part of the Ichiro story. And I think there is something relatively legitimate to considering him the real hit king, because I think you can look at what he did in Japan to what he did in America, and yes, he was playing against lesser competition in Japan, but not dramatically lesser, and you can't balance that out against the fact that he was playing a shorter schedule, which matters a lot for a guy like Ichiro who plays every damn day. And I don't have very much doubt that Ichiro would have finished with pretty close to the same number of career hits if he had his whole career in America. I mean, I guess the real watershed with the Japanese players was Nomo, right? Hideo Nomo, and then to a certain extent Ichiro, because Ichiro broke the barrier then for everyday players. But I mean, there was Murakami in the 60s, but that's like one guy, so right. He didn't last very long.
What are your thoughts, Rob, on the Japan League and maybe at some point getting status like the Negro Leagues where it's considered a major league?
It's a really interesting question because, there's a very clear, obviously there was a very clear color bar for the Negro Leagues players. They prior to 1947, they had no chance to play. It's not clear exactly to most of us anyway what the bar was that would have held, for example, O from playing in the major leagues here. It was cultural, no question. Japanese players were expected to stay in Japan. There was an agreement between Major League Baseball and Japanese baseball that American teams wouldn't raid their players. I haven't studied this in a long time. I don't remember why that agreement was made. In retrospect, it doesn't seem quite fair to the Japanese players. I don't think anyone questioned it at the time, at least not that I've ever read about. It was just the way it was done. I think it's probably true that, right or wrong, it was assumed that few, if any, Japanese players would have been good enough to play Major League Baseball, at least at a high level. Although I think that at some point, most people realized that O could have thrived in the major leagues. I think that Aaron or some superstar was quoted as saying that O would have hit 400 some home runs or 500 and been a Hall of Famer if he'd played in the States. But I don't think there was any real hunger among major league teams in the 1950s and 60s when Japanese baseball started sort of taking off again after the war to bring those guys over. Does that constitute an actionable bar that we should now go back and examine and try to compensate for? I don't know. I've never thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think and Rob alludes to this, I think the barrier was definitely on both sides of the Pacific. And it's, unlike the Negro Leagues where, there was resistance among, obviously, the Negro League owners didn't want to give their players up. But most everybody fairly quickly within a period of years recognized that, the Negro League players should be free to move into the major leagues and that was going to put an end to even the need for the existence of the leagues. Also, I mean, I think, the three of us are old enough to remember it. Maybe younger viewers don't, but, sort of arm's length commercial trade was one thing, but there was a hell of a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States from the war that was still there in the 70s. And I think, you could still see it in the 80s. I think that Americans didn't mind maybe going to see a Japanese monster movie, but I don't know. I think it would have taken a lot longer for fans to get over the being ready to root for a Japanese star on their hometown team. Whereas, by the time Nomo breaks in 96, there was much more of a sense that okay, Pearl Harbor's a really long time ago now.
And in the 80s, you think about this, your neighbor who was in World War II was only 60 something years old. And so that taint of that war and how they looked at those guys. I remember at one point saying that someone said that Japanese players weren't as good because their butts were too small, and something like ridiculous like that.
Well, and let's to be clear too, it really wasn't so much about the war per se. It was about the people who were in that war, where they came from, what they look like.
Right.
Because we got over any anti-German sentiment after the war really, really fast. And the anti-Japanese sentiment basically runs through our entire history.
Right.
In the 1920s, Japanese were, there was the Exclusionary Act, which I know it prevented Chinese immigrants, and I suspect Japanese immigrants, at least to some degree, as well. So this goes back 100 years. I would agree with. I've got a book about Murakami, which I've not read yet. I don't know what sort of issues he faced, but it's certainly a difference between a relief pitcher in San Francisco and a superstar hitter in many other parts of the country.
Let's really quickly go through your guys' ballots. Who would you have put in, Rob? Who are your 10 or less?
Right now, let me turn my screen off and go get the list this year, and I'll let Dan go first.
Okay, Dan, go first.
All right, yeah. So I got my list in front of me here. So I got 9 that I'm pretty sure on, which is Bonds, Clemens, A-Rod, Manny Ramirez, David Ortiz, Kurt Schilling, Andrew Jones, Todd Helton, and Scott Rowland. So I'm pretty sure I'd vote for those 9. Now that 10th slot, I hate to leave open because there are a lot of guys, but then you get to, you've got Sosa, who really is a borderline case because he really is a classic guy where, without the steroids, he doesn't do it. And because he's on the bubble, I don't think that's illegitimate to consider at the very side of it. But the other 3 guys I'm looking at who look to me like they have more or less a very similar case to Sosa qualitatively are Bobby Abreu, Jeff Kent, and Andy Pettit. And I know Pettit, of course, has the glamour. He pitched in New York. He pitched in the postseason. And I think we should count the postseason, certainly. I mean, it would be silly not to because that's kind of the point of the season is the postseason. I certainly think at David Ortiz's case, the massiveness of his postseason accomplishments, much like Mariano Rivera, is decisive. Pettit was not great in the postseason. I mean, he was good, and he was, he was good enough under some very difficult circumstances. I mean, the Yankees were, I think, 26-18 in his postseason starts, which is, that's not a great regular season winning percentage, but in the postseason, that's pretty good. You're sledding uphill every day in the postseason. You're not expecting your guys to be as dominant in a long postseason. So I don't know if I actually had a ballot that counted, who would I list as that 10th slot? I'm not sure.
Fair enough. And then while Rob looks for his, I'll go through
I've got mine.
Oh, okay. There you are. Okay. All right.
I'm ready.
All right. Go ahead, Rob.
I'm going to take my glasses off. I'm old. Hold on.
Yeah.
Sorry, everybody. And for me, I think my ballot is would be very close to Dan's, actually. But certainly Bonds, Clemens, Rodriguez, Rowland, and that's where it gets tricky. These people who say it's easy, it's so easy to find 10 and I need 15 slots. It's not that easy. It's for me. I can see 15 guys on here who you can make a case for, no question, at least 15. Would I vote for Ortiz? I would. But where he ranks in terms of wins above replacement among the guys in the ballot? 16th.
Wow.
Now, what pushes him over the limit for me is the postseason, and that absolutely needs to be considered. Does he deserve the title of greatest clutch hitter ever? No, that's a little overblown. But the truth is, and I wish I had the numbers in front of me, but he and Mariano Rivera are both just have this fantastic postseason value that I just don't think you can possibly ignore because of the impact that those things have on the course of baseball history. So now I've got Bonds, Clemens, Alex Rodriguez, Ortiz, Rowland. That's 5. And after that, because for me, you've got a lot of guys who are bunched together. And I honestly would have a pretty tough time coming up with, not that there aren't 5 more who deserve to be elected. I have a tough time figuring, because they're pretty close. I mean, when you look at wins above replacement, Andrew Jones and Todd Helton and Gary Sheffield and Andy Pettit and Bobby Abreu and Mark Burley, they're all 3 wins above replacement apart.
Right.
And I certainly wouldn't suggest that wins above replacement should be the be all and end all. I mentioned the postseason already, but there are other things that come into it. Durability. One thing I think gets neglected is the ability to mentor younger players. If you read books about or buy baseball players, you will read stories about a great pitcher who picked up their most important pitch from a teammate. There's some value there. I don't know if it's 1 win above replacement or if it's 20, but there's definitely some value there. So I think that I would happily vote, not happily in the case of maybe Bonds and Clemens, not the most attractive characters in history. I would enthusiastically vote for the 5 that I mentioned. And then I would start digging and digging and digging for those next 5 slots, if I even filled them. But it wouldn't be easy. It should be hard.
Yeah, and also if the guys on this list, we mentioned Ortiz and Pettit as guys where the postseason matters a lot, and obviously that's also true of Schilling. I don't think that Schilling. I mean, you could certainly make a case for Schilling's if he had never pitched in the postseason, but I think it's definitely a big item on his resume, and he was just an unbelievable big game pitcher, and that's such a big part of. I think the writers by now would have thrown him overboard a long time ago for his personality and his politics, were it not for those big games.
Well, I argued for Schilling for years, and I finally stopped a couple years ago because I realized if I'm voting, I am a baseball writer, and if Schilling seems to believe that writers, generally speaking, it's okay to string them up over a tree. I just think that if I'm a writer with a ballot in my hand, I've got a tough time checking that box for someone who espouses not that politics. I think that's or even personality, but that actual view. I'd have a tough time with it. He's absolutely performance-wise a Hall of Famer, no question, and should have been. I thought should have been elected on the first ballot.
Just briefly on my ballot, because I don't want to take too much time on it. Because I worry about the back end of the ballot, the 5%ers that need to be considered. And so I didn't vote for Alex Rodriguez and David Ortiz, in part because I'm confident that they'll get in and they'll have plenty of votes to survive. So I take liberties with that, but I think it's a reasonable thing. And I did give a vote for Helton and to Burley and to Bobby Abreu because we need to consider these guys more. Especially, I really think that we're going to look at Burley, and maybe I'm wrong on this, right? But I think that Burley's career was a little bit short. He had gas left in the tank, and he won so many games. He had the perfect game. He had the no-hitter. He was just one of those really special players. But I think we don't have the lens to see it yet because, and I'm not like a darling for Burley guy. I just think that we're going to have to reevaluate pitchers, and I think he will evaluate well in the future because he's just such a unique player.
Yeah,
well, go ahead, Dan.
No, I mean, I don't buy Burley as Hall of Famer, but I think we absolutely, consistency and durability are big underrated things, particularly when you combine them. I mean, that matters with somebody like Abreu as well, because baseball is not only played in seasons, it is played in consecutive seasons.
Right.
And certainly in the modern world of contracts, the ability of a guy to pay off the whole deal has a material benefit to his team over a period of time. But I think that it is absolutely a right and proper tribute to what Burley brought to the table that he get taken seriously as a Hall of Famer and not just thrown off immediately. So, I think there's maybe 5 or 6 guys who are actually going to make it this year.
Right.
Maybe I'm over optimistic, but
yeah. Rob, your thoughts on Burley?
Well, I haven't quite come around to him as a deserving Hall of Famer, but I certainly did come to a greater appreciation for him later in his career when he just kept doing it year after year after year after year. And I've always wondered if there is some value, some additional value that we're not measuring with a guy like Burley, because simply by being there season after season, and especially every start after start all season long, what does that mean for his team, his manager, the bullpen, that they can rely on him every fifth day when probably nobody else on the staff is going out there every 5 days for the whole season. I don't know if there's a way to measure that value. I think there's some value there that we're not measuring. I just don't know how much it is.
Yeah, I mean, the value of that for a pitcher in particular, I mean, that was like, there used to be people who were like, oh, well, Don Sutton doesn't really belong in the Hall of Fame. I'm like, okay, give me the list of the guys you could pencil in your rotation, and 22 years later, they've missed like one start.
Right.
Like, the list of that is basically just Don Sutton. I mean, I guess maybe Cy Young, but I mean, you ask any manager in baseball, like what he would give for that, particularly in today's game, and it's just off the charts.
Well, yeah, I used to play around with this thing I called organizational capital, and it never really went anywhere. I never thought about it hard enough, and it might not even make a lot of sense. But the idea was that everything you do as an organization requires some sort of capital, intellectual capital, financial capital, coaching capital, whatever it is, and by definition, there's a finite amount of all those things, of that organizational capital, and if you spend some of it here, that means you can't spend some of it there. If you don't have to spend some here, you can spend some there. So some energy that would have gone to filling all those missed starts for most pitchers, you don't have to fill with Mark Burley. He doesn't miss any starts. So I think I'm just sort of biased toward guys who you can just leave alone. They'll be there day in, day out.
The last time when he played from age 21 to age 36. The only time he didn't start 30 games was in his first year, and he stopped playing at 36. And he was essentially the same pitcher. Maybe he thought he was done and was getting lucky, because he for sure survived by giving up a lot of hits and managing to dance around it. But how valuable would a guy be who you knew you could throw out there and get 30 plus starts out of him?
Another guy like that sort of is Will Clark, who quit when he was still really good.
Right.
And Will Clark hasn't sniffed the Hall of Fame yet. Has he? Did I miss something?
No, I don't think so.
It's interesting when guys stop playing when they're still good. They stop chasing whatever those financial or performance goals are. I mean, there's no reason to think that Burley, or certainly Clark, there are a few others like that, couldn't have kept on going for 2 or 3 more years and perhaps built a really strong Hall of Fame resume. Does it make sense to hold that against them when you're voting? I don't know. You really probably don't want to guess what a 36-year-old player would have done if he'd hung around for 2 or 3 more years, because he obviously could have fallen off a cliff the next year, like so many have. But it just makes it a little tougher to evaluate those guys, I think.
Well, and maybe they find that next year. I mean, Jamie Moyer just kept playing and playing and playing.
Right.
Verlander has hung, and by staying longer than maybe he had to, he's made himself into basically a surefire Hall of Famer. Pettit and Mussina are very similar in terms of where they're at wins wise, but Mussina, he knew when to go. Oh, I'm done. 20 wins, I'm out. Whereas Pettit was like, I'm kind of retiring, I'm kind of not, and I think all of these things at the fringes make a difference.
Yeah, but Mussina, he could have kept on pitching and had him and gotten in sooner, most likely, right?
Right. Yeah, and in theory, could have even forced himself to get to 300 if he did like the Randy Johnson things, like I'm not retiring until I have 300 wins.
Yep.
Dan?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I mean, Mussina was doing a little bit with smoke and mirrors by the end, but there was enough smoke and enough mirrors left that he could easily have gotten those last 30 wins.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, listen, fellas, I love it. Love that we got a chance to have this conversation. Anything in closing, Dan?
I mean, I guess maybe we should the one thing I'll offer is my predictions, which is who I think is going to get in. I mean, I think if I had to put money on it, I think Bonds and Clemens make it this year. I actually think that they will be, because I think A-Rod is going to go in. I think Ortiz is going to go in. Okay. And I actually think there's, people don't vote in isolation. I think when you start looking at your ballot and you've got A-Rod and David Ortiz on there, maybe your resistance to putting in guys with steroid issues is going to be weaker a little. So I actually think the four of them are going to go in. I think Manny will go in. Maybe I'm wrong about that. And so, that's 6 guys. The other 2 who are on the bubble, really, I think, are Roland and Schilling. I do wonder if Schilling, by sort of publicly saying, I'm done with this, I don't even want it anymore, I don't know if that will give some people permission to drop them off their ballot, or permission to just be like, no, screw you, Kurt. Now we're putting you in. Like, I don't know. So Roland and Schilling, I don't know about, but I think the other 6 would be my prediction of who's going to go in.
That's a big class. Rob?
I will, first of all, here my disclaimer is that I have not studied this nearly as much as Dan has. But my gut is actually the opposite. I wouldn't be surprised if there were just 1 or 2 elected. I would guess that Ortiz makes it, and Schilling, Bonds, Clemens all come close, but don't quite. Roland takes a big jump, and Billy Wagner probably takes a nice jump, but that it winds up just being 1 or 2 guys. I wouldn't even want to guess who the second would be after Ortiz. But I just think historically it's always been tough to build enough consensus for more than 3 or 4 to make it in one season.
I miscounted, by the way. I said 6. It's 5. I just gave you 5 names and said 6. So.
Got it.
Fair enough. I think all the 10-year guys go off and nobody gets in, and then maybe David Ortiz gets in, and then of course that opens up the way for those guys on the back end. Like, the punishment has been served; they didn't get in their 10-year ballot, and they'll have to wait for a special committee, and then they all get in. All right. Well, listen, I appreciate you guys. It was super fun. Let's do it again next year, and then let's have some conversations between now and then.
Always great to be here, Pete.
Thanks, Pete. Appreciate it.
No worries.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you.